Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I join my fellow speakers in thanking Will for including me in the program and Greg for the organisation of this extremely stimulating event. My topic's federalism, and I was reminiscing this morning as we walked along from the Esplanade Hotel about an important incident in the history of Australian federalism, showing it in an extremely poor light. Some of you may recall that 20 years ago, when Paul Keating was the Prime Minister, he decided, amongst other things, that Australia needed a world-class orchestra, that it should be the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. It should be paid for by reductions in the size and the expenditure on all other orchestras in the country. This opinion may have been strongly supported in the environs of Sydney. It didn't quite get as much resonance in the rest of the country, and a number of people got together in a delegation and went to see Paul Keating and explained that what he was proposing would not only be bad for the orchestras in the rest of the country, would be actually bad for the Sydney Symphony, because it would reduce, there'd be a reduction in the competition between the orchestras, which they felt was an inducement to quality, but also it would have an adverse impact on these other orchestras from which the best players in the Sydney Symphony might well be drawn in the future.
John, could you please bring the microphone closer to your mouth?
Which microphone? Is that better? Hi?
It'd be this one here.
How's that? I very much doubt that Paul Keating was interrupted like that. Keating's response to this argument was simply to say, as he drew the interview to a close, "Listen, mate, in this country, if you don't live in Sydney, you're just camping out." Now, I'd like to say I've been coming to Fremantle. I first came to Fremantle in January of 1958, and I'm always very happy to be coming back here, and if this is camping out, let's have more of it. As I said, I'm here to speak about federalism, and as has been... am I doing okay now, JJ? Great. Just give me a signal if... most people think it's a relief not to be able to hear me, but... I'm here to talk about federalism, and as has been customary throughout my life, I'm, as usual, backing a horse that's been losing throughout most of my life, but I remain an unrepentant enthusiast for federalism, and I'm going to speak enthusiastically about it today. And I'm going to have a few words to say about a word that has a great deal of currency in public policy discourse in this country, namely equality, which I think is even if we assume it's achievable, I think it has a bad influence on federalism and the virtues which it brings to a society. Let me just recall for you the advantages of federalism. They are, first of all, diversity, variety, opportunity and choice. That's the purpose of federalism, that everybody isn't just put into the one box, so to speak. Another strength of federalism is characterised as self-government, the idea that the communities run their own affairs as much as possible. That particular virtue of federalism is often spurned. People make the comment that, we don't have much democracy around whatever particular small community they identify, or even large community like Sydney, for example. I think it was yesterday's Sydney Morning Herald had a fairly strong article, opinion piece by Elizabeth Farrelly, about how pretty well everybody gets a say in how central Sydney is developed except the people. So that particular aspect of federalism is not always felt to be realised in practice, but it does have another effect, and that is that even if the local community aren't making decisions about their living circumstances, it may at least have the effect of stopping somebody else from imposing solutions upon you. That is to say that even if federalism doesn't necessarily enhance local decision making, it may have the effect of deconcentrating and decentralising power and preventing others from imposing their will on particular communities. Well, I just refresh your mind of those traditional virtues of federalism as a context for my remarks that are about to follow. I've been thinking about this subject now for 18 months. In fact, before Will suggested that I might come along to this gathering to speak. It was prompted by an interview on ABC Radio National, as it then was. We know it today as Radio RN. It used to be Radio National for early on a Saturday morning. Federalism's a good subject for early on Saturday morning, with Paul McClintock, who at that stage was about to retire as chairman of the COAG Reform Council. A very ominous name. Anybody know what the COAG Reform Council does? Yeah, well, JJ, you don't count, and besides, you had notice of the a real participant in this conference got any idea what? Well, let me tell you what the COAG Reform Council does. And Mr McClintock and his successor, John Brumley, the former Premier of Victoria, filled the role admirably. It's a rather headmasterly body that basically marks the homework of the states and territories on various assignments that they get given for the improvement and betterment of the lives of all of us. Well, he was about to step down from this lofty perch, and he opined that what we needed before the next elections was a good, rigorous, thoroughgoing debate on federalism. And I thought for myself, albeit it being a Saturday morning and one likes to have a bit of a rest on weekends, I thought to myself, this is an absurd proposition, because in this country we couldn't possibly have a rigorous, thoroughgoing debate on federalism, because federalism, in as much as it survives as a latent value, it's in recess. It's had so little advocacy and so little support for so many years that the idea that we could have a vigorous, thoroughgoing debate about the Federation, he didn't indicate, incidentally, the purpose of this debate, except to say we need to be clear about who does what. I thought the answer was fairly simple. The Commonwealth either does it or wants to do it. But we should be deciding who does what, and of course we have to get rid of overlap and duplication. Now, overlap and duplication are great favourites, and I've done quite a few exercises over my career in pursuing overlap and duplication, and I reckon you'd be in a better chance of finding the Malaysian aeroplane that went missing several months ago than you would finding overlap and duplication in the Federation. What you do have is, of course, a lot of transaction costs in the working of the Federation, which is a slightly different thing. Why can't we have a vigorous, informed debate about Federation? The federal sentiment, let me underline, is fairly strong in this country. in an implicit way. If you look at most national organisations, they are still federally constructed. That is to say that their governing bodies are composed of 2 or 3 people nominated by each state and territory. One of the shining examples of this particular feature of the national fibre is none other than the Australian Labor Party, which, as you know, believes we should be a unified country. We should have unified government. It thinks we should abolish the states. Until the late 1960s, the supreme governing body of the Labor Party was its national conference, which I think it was called the Federal Conference, and it was composed of 6 representatives from each of the state branches. You all know about this body, or I think you all know about it, because we don't often necessarily think of it as the Federal Conference. What we do is think of it as the 36 faceless men. It was 36 faceless men, although on the crucial occasion I understand there was actually 35 faceless men and 1 faceless woman. And even in more recent times, as the Labor Party, some of their apologists like to put it, that they've democratised the party. But in running one man, one person, one vote, the Labor Party is very keen on advocating for the rest of the country, but it has never applied to running the Labor Party itself. The Labor Party is still basically a state-based party with a number of qualifications to take account of other, as it were, interests that should be represented at the National Conference. But there are a host of bodies, the AMA, and so forth, all of which are basically federally structured. And I see you think this is very funny, John, but you appreciate the House of Representatives principle is not often used for a national organisation in this country. The principle that is used is the Senate, and a very good principle it is too. So the federal gene in the country is quite strong. But for some reason or other, it's not as strong as we'd like it to be. Well, why is this so? Well, most of the people who participate in public debates in this country come through our universities, and they, not quite all of them, but many of them study in get called social sciences. They study law or history or political science or economics, and so it goes on. We'll come to economics later, but the first 3, law, history and politics, are very corrosive where federalism is concerned. In the case of the law, we had a brief period, which is best regarded as the federal period, when people, the lawyers and people who had some background in the law, saw constitutional law as it related to the structure of the nation. They saw it as a different type of law to other inherited law from the United Kingdom. Indeed, of course, they were strongly influenced by constitutional law as it had developed in the United States, leading up to and subsequent to the creation of the United States of America. A number of them, including Deakin, but most especially Andrew Inglis Clark, who is the author of the first draft of the Constitution, they actually went to the United States. Inglis Clark lived there for quite a number of, I think, 15 months in all, and he had many discussions with the leading figures of American life, politicians, judges, historians, journalists, and so forth. This sentiment, this foundation federal sentiment, of course, was strongly represented when the High Court was constituted. The eventual author of the Constitution, Sir Samuel Griffith, became the Chief Justice, and the other justices were Edmund Barton, the leader of the Convention and subsequently first Prime Minister, and Richard O'Connor, who had been leader of the ministry in the Senate. And they construed the Constitution and addressed issues in terms of the respective relationships and what one expected of the Commonwealth in relation to the states. They did a fairly good job, but it wasn't a totally satisfactory job. There were some confusions and muddles. And in 1920, a case arose, the engineers' case, and the founding justices, having left the court, Griffith, Barton and O'Connor, they left the court. There was a new court. The survivors of the conventions, Isaacs and Higgins, were both nationalists rather than federalists in orientation. That is to say, federalism was merely a means to a nationalist end. And there were a number of other judges who had simply known the federal debate only at second hand. And the problems created by a succession of earlier cases were dramatically exposed by the cunning man of the era, Mr. Menzies, Mr. R.G. Menzies, who'd only been at the bar for about 2 years. The court agreed to reopen all the precedents, and in the event, the federal approach to the Constitution was overthrown in favour, amongst other things, of a conventional British approach to statutory construction, which meant that whenever the Constitution was being interpreted, the powers of the Commonwealth would be given their full expression, and only after that we would see whether there was any space left for the states. Find it's not quite so much the case these days, but by and large the proposition still holds. Find any lawyer, say something, suggest that it might be a good idea to have another look at the engineer's case, and this person will know that you are uninformed and possibly even on drugs. The engineer's case is wholly writ. In a secular age, it's wholly writ, especially amongst lawyers. Let's take the historians. Jeff, feel completely free to correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think my own reading of history, of the writers of Australian history, is, even if not quite all of them are dedicated centralists, they nonetheless rejoice in the triumph of the nation as it grows and develops. They see that if the Commonwealth is in any way impeded in its aggrandisement, then that's a case of backwardness in the polity. We do have some important books about the regions and states of Australia. But most of them don't deal with the development of their state or region in terms of as it were, what might have been were it not for the increasing penetration of the Commonwealth into the life of the nation. Political science. Political science in this country, oddly or sadly, has been dominated by Westminster. You might, if you were studying Australian government, you might study the works of Walter Bagehot on the English Constitution. It's highly unlikely that you will read the Federalist Papers. It's fairly unlikely that you will read Democracy in America. The notion, and this became very clear in 1975, Greg was talking about 1975, one of the reasons in particular that most political scientists, not all political scientists, but most political scientists totally got 1975 wrong was that they were enveloped in a Westminster view of Parliament, the rights of the House of Commons, the role of an upper chamber. They just simply were unable to see that the government of Australia was a different matter to the government of Britain. This remains the case, but there is now a different explanation for why the political science of Australia is so dominated by Britain. Most of the practising political scientists, particularly on Australian government, have come from Britain. It's not surprising that they remain totally within the intellectual framework of British government without realising that in this country we have founded, we have run for over 110 years, 115 years, a very successful form of government which embodies the core Westminster principle that the executive is drawn from the Parliament and is responsible to the Parliament, but that in many other respects, including the structure of the Parliament itself, the relationship between the lower house and the upper house, we have developed our own method of governing. And let me be quite blunt about this, if it were not for the Senate, there would be very little parliamentary control over government, executive government in Australia. That's how important the structure of our Parliament is at the moment. Now, there may be a case for reconsidering some details of that arrangement at the moment, but it doesn't alter the basic principle that it is because of the Senate that we still have some form of parliamentary control over executive governments, which we wouldn't have if we had a unicameral government. Economists are a bit more difficult. I think, and you can comment on this later, JJ, rather than having a conversation in the middle of the speech. Economists, in my view, in general, are not very fond of federalism because they see it as just a series of impediments to the free operation of markets, and that it's therefore undesirable for that reason. But there is, as it were, a little area of economics which takes an intense interest in the workings of the Federation. It comes in through the distribution of revenues through the Grants Commission processes and related budgetary processes of the Commonwealth Government, and people in that particular area, as it were, are more sympathetic to the workings of the federalism of the Federation, but nonetheless it's a fairly specialist area. It's not the... I think that if Mr McClintock were to get his great national debate on federalism going, I feel that the specialists in fiscal equalisation would not be among the early speakers and the more prominent speakers, the people being invited on to the 7:30 report late line and of course the bulk report on Sunday mornings. So you can see that, and I stand to be corrected on this, but I don't think there's a single stream of learning in this country which stresses the advantages that we get from the diversity and the variety that the federal system offers us. Now, I just come to the final part of this address, and I can see as well, I'm telling you a lie because my glasses aren't very good. But I know that a lot of you are saying, what's all this got to do with the talent for bureaucracy and the atrophy of federalism? Those of you who have still remembered what the title of the address is. Well, let me, Mr Menzies used to say, your patience is now going to be richly rewarded. Let me tell you what the talent for bureaucracy is all about. This came out in a famous book, well, it was famous when I was an undergraduate, called Australian Democracy, and the very opening paragraph, this was, I might say so, this was quite shattering to a young undergraduate back in the 1960s. The characteristic talent of Australians is not for improvisation, nor even Republican manners. Now, any of you who find this very disturbing, you'd better leave now, because the killer punch comes in. It is for bureaucracy. We take a somewhat hesitant pride in this, since it runs counter not only to the archaic and cherished image of ourselves as ungovernable, if not actually lawless, but more importantly because we've been trained in the modern period to see our politics in terms of liberalism, which accords to bureaucracy only a small and rather shady place. Being a good bureaucrat is, we feel, a bit like being a good forger. And then he said the pervasiveness of bureaucracy is a feature of most industrial societies, and its spread, which has been slow and steady, has its roots not only in developing technology, but also, and especially in its political application, in the modern demand for security and equality, of which more anon. And he concludes that Australian appetites have merely been, in a general way, larger and coarser than the average and much more concentratedly political. Bureaucracy means many things. I've got a little passage here from Weber. You all know about Weber. You all know about Weber, don't you? He talks about the advantages of bureaucracy: precision, speed, unambiguity, continuity, discretion, unity, strict subordination. But at the end of it all, deep in the heart of any bureaucratic organisation, what we have is uniformity and standardisation. Now, in the operation of our federation, you will hear in the debate on whatever is the latest report on any subject of welfare or education or health or industry, what you will hear is a lot of stress on equality and equalisation, how any Australian, wherever they are in the country, is entitled to the same level of services. And of course the buzzword, the key word, is always equality. Go through the reports that we're always getting from those bodies that Will and JJ pointed out, and of course ad hoc inquiries. Go through them and have a look at whether they think about what the word equality means, whether it's a good thing. They don't even get to a level of depth where they address the very banal but important distinction between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Equality is a refrain, and many suggestions in public policy are usually killed very simply by simply saying, well, it won't be, some people will be unequally affected by this. Just because some people will be unequally affected, we can't proceed. Equality is the hurrah word used by Commonwealth negotiators as they go about shaping the public policy administration of the country on a standardised and uniform basis. That is why I say that, or I argue that equality is playing a crucial role in the erosion of federalism in terms of allowing variety, diversity, opportunity and choice. And that is why I say the talent for bureaucracy, deep in the national gene, the talent for bureaucracy underlies the atrophy of federalism. Now, I'm looking forward to you all taking issue with most, if not all, of what I've had to say.
Yes, John Hyde.
Well, I enjoyed that, but I still bear a few scars from this particular debate. When I hear states' rights, I do shudder, draw back. My belief in divided power, therefore I believe in federalism, there's one hell of a lot of endurance in it. But you asked why we can't have a civilised and sensible debate about it. And I suggest to you it might be the damn premiers don't want it. I can remember raising an issue of taxation and suggesting they get their powers back if they were prepared to take their taxing authority back. I was probably, given the date when it happened, probably thinking of income tax powers at the time, but I wouldn't do it. And anyway, Dave Brand, who was Premier at the time, took me aside after the debate and said, John, the last thing we want is taxing powers. When Fraser tried to introduce taxing powers, give them back to the states, only WA was in the least cooperative.
New South Wales was.
Or a lot of talk about double taxation, remember?
Well, Eric Willis said he'd run with it, and he lost an election to Neville Wran.
Sorry, yeah.
And Neville Wran was the one who did him down on double taxation.
Yeah, it was divided. But it was the double taxation argument that killed it. Those premiers weren't really interested. And if you look at the way that the state governments treat local government, it's every bit as centralist as the way that the federal government treats state government. Now, it does seem to me that we can't have a sensible debate because those who might want to take back authority don't want to take back responsibility, and that applies everywhere. You agree?
Well, yes, the only point that I'd make, John, is that I think a debate to be effective, you'd have to go beyond just the premiers. So that, in fact, what you'd have to have is a pretty good debate amongst, what do they call, the policy communities, which would draw the premiers in. I think that's the view I would take. But I do agree with you, the premiers are not keen on public debate about issues of this character in particular, and one of the impediments is, of course, that for whatever they have to say, they are not interested in resuming revenue responsibilities, which in lots of ways is a central question.
Got quite a few questions. I'll just go on this side. Rob?
I wasn't the first to put my hand up, but again, I'm an economist, so perhaps there's a filter in my perspective on this. But I've just recently read Ross Garneau's book called Dog Days, Australia After the Boom. And as you all know, Ross Garneau is originally from Western Australia, but is very much a person of the Labor Party and traditionally has held centralist views consistent with that. And of course, he's very close to Bob Hawke, who we all know has extremely centralist views.
Another Western Australian, of course. Another Western Australian.
Correct, yes, which is ironic. But what's very interesting is that in this book, he has a chapter in which he says that we have a lack of political efficiency because Australian voters don't understand the constitutional divide between states and federal governments, and are never reminded of this fact, and so are never able to assign responsibility for good or ill about politics to either their state or their federal government. And that this is something that demarcation needs to be made fairly clearly. It's my sense, and I'd like your opinion on this, it's my sense that that this, first of all, this is an unusual statement coming from a Labor person, but also that neither the state politicians nor the federal politicians have a very strong interest in clarifying the areas of responsibility, which is the same point made earlier. But it's always very nice to be able to blame the other guys if something goes wrong. But I'm curious as to your view on it.
Yes, this is a very important point that you've raised, and if I can just underline the point that formed part of my answer to John Hyde, in terms of underlining to the public who's responsible for what. It's not just the responsibility of politicians. There are other people who are active in these fields. But in my own observation on this question, there is now a view, in fact it's an orthodoxy down in Canberra, that Australians don't care which level of government does something as long as it's done, whatever the problem happens to be. Now, there's been a shift in my lifetime because back in, certainly when the Menzies government was in office, Sir Robert Menzies would quite often simply say, he'd get a question, what are you going to do about such and such? And he'd say, nothing, it's a state responsibility. That option has not been open to a Prime Minister for at least 30 years. Maybe John Hyde might have a view on this, maybe Malcolm Fraser was the last, Malcolm Fraser's government was the last one that might plausibly have been able to get away with that particular point of view. But that is all part of the decline of federalism. That in our public debates we've lost interest in who should be doing what and how it should be done. And just because it's done in a particular way in Brisbane doesn't mean it has to be done that way in Adelaide.
Yes. Austin Erickson. So I think there's actually a separate question in this debate about how many states Australia should actually have, as well as the sort of powers they have. What do you think the ideal number is at the moment for Australia? Are we too few, too many?
A few too many. Well, we can't lose many, and we won't have any. Look, this is a matter a bit like this is a Burkean question. What we have is 6 states. We can't invent any more. There's no pressure to have any more. There has in the past, of course, been new states movements in North Queensland and North New South Wales in the Riverina. But they had their high tide, at least in recent times, in the 60s probably. I don't think that there's particularly an optimum number of states. What you have to do is work with what you've got. We've got six states at the moment. None of them I suppose if South Australia was a business, it would probably have to be thinking about amalgamation with Victoria. And maybe even Tasmania would have to think about amalgamation with Victoria. But of course the sentiment is far too strong on both fronts.
If I could just briefly add to that before I answer this question. We have 2 pseudo-states, the Northern Territory and the ACT. Mm-hmm. And as a federalist, I'd be glad to be rid of those 2 pseudo-states.
Well, I'd right behind you there. I, of course, take a little bit of interest in the ACT government, and just let me give you the horrors about the ACT government. They've decided amongst themselves, there are only 17 of them, which is, might well be argued is sort of 10 too many, but there are 17 of them, and they've decided that they have this terrible burden of, sitting fully 36 days a year, able to go home at night, all this sort of thing. They've decided that they need more. They need more, preferably 25. And the big punchline is, why do you really need more? Well, we need to have more ministers so that we've got enough to go round to all the COAG committee meetings in the federal.
Thank you, John. Adam Crichton from Australia. I was just prompted by John's remarks earlier. I'm interested in the Fraser episode, the attempt to make way for the states to tax. It wasn't the problem there that the Fraser government never actually made way, never cut its own taxes. That's the first question. And then secondly, the Commission of Audit, which came down earlier this year, they had a chapter or two on the Federation, and they made a very specific recommendation that the Commonwealth government cut the main marginal tax rate of 32.5% to 22.5%, and then basically state the states, right, well, you now tell us how much extra we should put onto that main rate, which of course, because most workers actually pay that marginal rate, will affect all the workers in those states, and so the state governments therefore will be very sensitive to the particular level of that extra rate. What do you think of that particular proposal? And then I guess that leads into the white paper, the Federation white paper that the government has promised and is now underway. Does that inspire you with any confidence?
Oh, well, the second part's easy. Well, what do you think? On the second, the first point, Fraser left it rather late in the day, and then he did do it he was very gentle about it, and it was so quickly killed effectively by Neville Wran, as John highlighted. But clearly, if there was a federal government that was determined to act, they would have to have a good deal more backbone than Malcolm Fraser brought to the task. Incidentally, the Fraser legislation remained on the statute books until 1992. And in 1992, John Hewson said that he'd be activating it straight away when he was elected. And Paul Keating, I mean, you know how John Hewson's always telling us that he wasn't a very good politician. Well, it took Paul Keating about a week to deal with that one. He just simply walked into the House of Representatives, repealed the legislation, and it simply... And of course, repealing legislation now is deadly because there is legislation you can get repealed, but if you wanted to bring it on again, you would have enormous difficulties with the Senate.
Well, working this way. Yes, Jonathan.
I'm just a thorough dissenter. If you want choice, you have to have competition. The essence of federalism, as opposed to any other structural arrangement, is that it encourages competition of a kind that isn't easily available elsewhere. And that's competition between the central government and the state government for doing the same task. Competition inevitably leads to overlap and duplication, as you can see any time we go into the major supermarkets in Australia, Coles and Woolworths. They're very competitive, they carry very similar products. Consequence of competition is diversity in the initial instance, but maybe a tendency towards copying each other in order to retain the market. We have the notion of assigning tasks is a centrist notion. It is not a federalist notion. Federalist notion is opposed to that. It is let's compete rather than let's cooperate to divide up the market. You do this, we do that. Let's not compete with each other. Let me give you an example. The Commonwealth competes with the states in provision of public education. It has no schools, but it does it by funding competition to state-based, state-funded state schools. The federal government competes with state hospitals by providing a subsidy to private alternatives to state hospitals via the subsidy to private health insurance. There are many instances of that kind of competition is ruled out by the rationalist view of let's start and assign all the pre-assign all the tasks to this level of government, that level of government. Let's get rid of competition. Not for me.
I'll take that as a comment.
Mannkal.
Michael from the University of WA. I'd just like to say I found this talk very interesting, but I think you probably overstated the equality argument. I say this because, if I remember correctly, the official historical account of the Grants Commission is called Equity and Diversity. I might be corrected, but the theme there is they are seeking both equality and diversity. With equalisation being a capacity, not an outcome. So these things are discussed, and states do have quite different policies, even though they have capacity equalisation. The other point is the extent of equalisation seems to be exaggerated in your description. Everyone is not entitled to the same level of service. If you just ignore the capacity versus the equity outcome or equalisation outcome. If each state decides to have remote communities like the equivalent of the Kimberley, not having a police station or having a very small state, and that standard across all states, then the level of service in remote areas would be equalised across the country versus the level of services of individuals. There's no attempt in the equalisation process to say it doesn't matter where a citizen is located. It says it doesn't matter which state they're located in. So they're in a remote WA or remote New South Wales, government should have capacities to provide the same level of service. There's no assumption that the same level of service is provided across the whole spatial area.
I don't know that I'm in particular disagreement with quite a bit of what you've had to say, but the way I characterise this matter, I know the book you're referring to. My defence is that I've sat through many speeches, addresses and lectures by Justice Else-Mitchell and Professor Matthews, and if I haven't quite got it right, it hasn't been for want of trying. My more serious response is I'd actually had to be brief in this address, but my basic view is I really hardly got started on equality.
Two quick questions, one here and then a second there.
George Kalis, Notre Dame. On the High Court, Federalism and the Constitution, do you see a beam of hope or maybe a glimmer of hope in the High Court's decisions in Pape and Williams, the Chapman's cases, where they suggested that certainly the executive needed to be more closely to enumerated powers under the Constitution?
Yes, in general, there is a bit of a view that by the sort of the small number of people in favour of opening up engineers, there is a view that you'd be in with a chance, obviously not a very big chance. In relation to the cases you're referring to, I think I'd put it a bit more highly than a glimmer of hope, but not in terms of federalism. I think that those decisions are extremely significant in undoing some of the executive domination of Parliament in relation to the allocation of public expenditure, and that those decisions will force governments to be much more specific in their legislation and in getting legal authority to spend, and that will be a welcome reinforcement of parliamentary control over public finances.
Yes.
Peter Kennedy, Notre Dame. John just asked you to get out your crystal ball about federalism, and you might remember that Kevin Rudd, in his first term...
Who?
Kevin Rudd, in his first term, wanted to Commonwealth...
I think I've heard of him, yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I think I've heard of Kevin Rudd.
Wanted the Commonwealth to have a bigger say in the running of public hospitals,
yes,
in return for a third of the state's GST. Colin Barnett said no. Now,
not loudly, effectively, but not loudly enough. It was a bad idea.
Okay. Now, with regard to Tony Abbott and the current government, the inference is that they want the states to have a bigger say in the running, or the financing rather, of health and education in a couple of years' time. Do you think that'll happen? And what does that mean with regard to federalism? Is there a move towards federalism, or is it just cost shifting?
Well, there always has to be a base line running through whatever worthy objective you're pursuing. So cost shifting is no doubt an element of it. I would say possibly, but there is a problem at the moment, I think, in the wobbliness of quite a number of the state governments, and whether that would give them, whether they'd be sufficiently robust from what might be called some statesman-like measures. That we'd probably be wise to be cautious, if not necessarily pessimistic.
One thing I've got out of your fascinating talk, John, reminded me of the fact that Britons coming to Australia are often frustrated, surprised and contemptuous of federalism. Okay, I mean, how can it be that you have, different states? So what your talk brings out to me is that essentially federalism is a Lassonian growth. We were essentially a British society. We grafted unsuccessfully an American system onto us, and it hasn't really sort of taken, regrettably. Would that be a reasonable...
No, I don't think that's... I think if you have a federal system, you're always going to have a lot of... federal systems will never be tidy systems. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why a good federal system is a lively system, because in fact it won't be tidy and there'll always be argy-bargy and debate. The thing about federalism is it'll be out in public. In Britain, for example, if they have these sorts of debates until, as it were, the recent pressure for devolution, if these debates ever took place between, say, the north of England and southwest England, they took place in complete privacy, in Whitehall, among officials. At least if we have them in this country, they take place in public. And we get public statements and we can read about them in the newspapers, and sometimes we can see the people on television. So that would be my reaction to that proposition, Will.